The manila folder hit Agent Fletcher's desk with a thud that echoed through the FBI's New York field office, December 15, 1950. Inside that folder lay secrets that would shake America's understanding of its most beloved crooner. Frank Sinatra wasn't just being watched, he was about to become the center of the most controversial investigation in entertainment history, one that would blur the lines between patriotism, prejudice, and the price of the American dream. Agent Fletcher opened the file with trembling hands. The first photograph showed Frank backstage at the Copa, but it wasn't alone. Standing beside him were men whose names appeared on wanted posters across the nation, men who controlled more than just nightclubs, men who could make careers or destroy them. What Fletcher saw next would haunt him for decades. Frank's eyes in that photograph weren't those of a guilty man, but of someone who had no idea his world was about to collapse. The second photograph was even more damning. Frank sat at a corner table in what appeared to be a private dining room, leaning forward in animated conversation with a man whose face bore the unmistakable scars of street violence. Between them lay an envelope, thick with what could only be cash. The timestamp showed 3:47 a.m. February 11, 1950. The location, a back room at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, an establishment known to be controlled by organized crime figures. But Agent Fletcher didn't know the full story behind that photograph. What the surveillance cameras couldn't capture was the conversation that had led to that moment, a conversation that revealed not criminal conspiracy, but the desperate measures of a man trying to protect his family from threats he couldn't even report to the police. The surveillance had begun quietly in 1947, but by 1950, it had become an obsession within J. Edgar Hoover's bureau. Frank Sinatra, born Francis Albert Sinatra in Hoboken, New Jersey, to Italian immigrant parents, represented something that terrified the establishment. Here was a man who had risen from the streets of Little Italy to command the attention of millions, who could make Bobby Soxers faint with a single note, and whose influence extended far beyond the recording studio. J. Edgar Hoover himself had taken a personal interest in the Sinatra case. In his private memos, later released under the Freedom of Information Act, Hoover described Frank as a person of interest whose associations and activities pose a potential threat to national security. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. The most powerful law enforcement official in America had declared war on a singer from New Jersey. In those days, America was gripped by fears that would define a generation. The Cold War had begun in earnest. Senator Joseph McCarthy was building his anti-communist crusade, and the FBI was expanding its domestic surveillance operations with unprecedented aggressiveness. Into this atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia walked Frank Sinatra, cocky, talented, and fatally Italian at a time when Italian meant one thing to most federal investigators: organized crime. The Bureau's institutional prejudices ran deep. Internal training materials from this period, discovered in declassified files decades later, contained explicit instructions for agents to pay special attention to individuals of Italian descent who have achieved unusual success or influence. The reasoning was simple and racist. In the FBI's worldview, Italian Americans who rose above their station were automatically suspect, their success evidence of criminal support rather than talent or hard work. The real investigation began with a phone call. On March 15, 1947, an anonymous tip reached the Bureau's New York office. "Sinatra's been meeting with Charlie Luciano's people," the caller whispered before hanging up. The tip was unverified, possibly fabricated, but it landed on the desk of an ambitious young agent named William Fletcher, who saw an opportunity to make his career by taking down America's most famous crooner. Fletcher was a product of the FBI Academy's elite training program, a Midwestern Protestant who viewed the ethnic neighborhoods of New York with suspicion and distaste. In his personal notes, he described his assignment to investigate Frank Sinatra as an opportunity to expose the criminal infiltration of American popular culture. The language revealed both his professional ambition and his personal biases. Fletcher's first surveillance report, filed 3 days later, revealed the methodical nature of the investigation to come. Subject observed, entering Copacabana nightclub at 10:15 p.m. via rear entrance. Remained inside until 2:30 a.m. Departed with 3 unidentified males of Mediterranean appearance. The language was clinical, professional, but it masked a deeper truth. The Bureau was building a case based more on ethnic profiling than actual evidence. What Fletcher couldn't have known was that Frank was struggling with demons that had nothing to do with organized crime. The pressures of fame at such a young age, the constant touring, the demands of recording contracts, and the growing tensions in his marriage to Nancy Barbado had left him emotionally fragile. The last thing he needed was the federal government treating him like public enemy number one, but that reality remained hidden from federal eyes watching his every move. The surveillance operation expanded rapidly through 1947 and 1948. What had begun as a single agent following Frank occasionally grew into a full-scale operation involving dozens of agents, surveillance specialists, and technical personnel. Phone taps were installed at Frank's homes in New York and California. His mail was intercepted and photographed before delivery. His business associates, family members, and romantic interests all became subjects of investigation. His longtime manager, George Evans, watched Frank's transformation with growing alarm. "The kid's changing," Evans confided to his wife. "He used to trust everyone, now he suspects everyone. They're destroying him without even charging him with anything." Evans had built his career on understanding public relations, but he had never faced a situation where the federal government itself had become his client's enemy. Evans tried to shield Frank from the worst of the surveillance, but it was impossible to hide completely. Recording sessions were interrupted by technical difficulties that Evans suspected were caused by FBI interference. Business meetings were postponed when participants worried about government retaliation. Even social gatherings became exercises in paranoia, as Frank's friends wondered whether their conversations were being recorded. The investigation intensified through 1948 and 1949. FBI agents followed Frank from coast to coast, photographing his associates, recording his conversations when possible, and building a file that would eventually span over 1,400 pages. They documented every nightclub appearance, every recording session, every social gathering. What emerged was a portrait not of a criminal, but of a young man navigating the complex social networks of mid-century American entertainment. Yet the Bureau saw only guilt in every interaction. The agents assigned to Frank's case developed detailed psychological profiles based on their observations. Agent Fletcher's reports described him as volatile and unpredictable with marked tendencies toward paranoid behavior. What Fletcher didn't recognize was that the paranoia was justified. Frank was being watched, his privacy was being violated, and his career was being systematically undermined by the very government he had served during World War II. But here's what shocked even seasoned FBI investigators when they read the classified reports. Frank hadn't just been observed associating with suspected criminals, he had been actively courted by them. The mob saw in Sinatra something the FBI feared, a powerful cultural voice that could influence American opinion. In the zero-sum game of 1950s politics, that made him either an asset or a threat, but never just an entertainer. The organized crime families of New York, Chicago, and Las Vegas had indeed taken notice of Frank Sinatra's rising star, but their interest wasn't necessarily criminal, it was business. Frank could fill nightclubs, sell records, and draw crowds wherever he appeared. In the entertainment economy of the 1940s and 1950s, that made him valuable to anyone in the business, legitimate or otherwise. The surveillance reports from the Havana incident in February 1947 would become the cornerstone of the FBI's case against Frank. He had traveled to Cuba supposedly for a singing engagement, but Bureau agents discovered that his visit coincided with a gathering of America's most notorious crime bosses. Lucky Luciano, recently deported from the United States, was holding court at the Hotel Nacional, and Frank Sinatra was photographed entering the building. The Havana trip would haunt Frank for the rest of his life, but the full story was more complicated than the FBI files suggested. Frank had indeed gone to Havana to perform, but he had also carried with him a suitcase containing $2 million in cash money that belonged not to him, but to crime figures who were using his celebrity status as cover for their operations. Frank later claimed he didn't know what was in the suitcase, that he was simply doing a favor for friends. Years later, in private conversations with trusted associates, Frank would reveal the true story of the Havana trip. He had been approached by men he knew from his neighborhood in Hoboken, men who had helped his mother during difficult times when Frank was a child. They needed someone above suspicion to carry money to Havana, and they appealed to his sense of loyalty and gratitude. Frank, young and naive about the implications, agreed without asking too many questions. The psychological toll of the investigation became apparent in Frank's behavior throughout 1950. Friends reported mood swings, explosive anger at perceived slights, and a growing isolation that would characterize much of his later life. His marriage to Nancy began to deteriorate under the strain, not helped by his increasingly public relationship with Ava Gardner, the Hollywood actress whose own complicated past made her an additional target of FBI interest. Nancy Sinatra bore the brunt of the investigation's impact on the family. FBI agents questioned their neighbors, their children's teachers, and their domestic staff. Phone calls to the house were monitored, mail was delayed, and family outings were observed and documented. Nancy, who had married a struggling singer from Hoboken, now found herself living under virtual house arrest in her own home. Ava Gardner noticed the change in Frank almost immediately after they began their affair in 1949. Frank was different then, she would later tell confidants. There was a hunted look in his eyes, like a beautiful animal caught in a trap. The FBI surveillance reports detailed their every meeting, every argument, every reconciliation, turning their love affair into evidence in a case that threatened to destroy them both. The Bureau's files on Ava revealed their own biases and prejudices. Agents described her as a woman of loose morals and potentially subversive influence on subject. They noted her previous relationships with men they considered politically unreliable, and they suggested that her affair with Frank was part of a larger pattern of associating with undesirable elements. The language was clinical, but the misogyny was unmistakable. Ava's own background made her a target of FBI scrutiny, independent of her relationship with Frank. Born in rural North Carolina to a poor farming family, she had risen to Hollywood stardom through a combination of beauty, talent, and determination. But her frank discussions of sexuality, her refusal to conform to Hollywood's moral codes, and her outspoken political views made her suspect in the eyes of federal investigators who valued conformity above all else. Throughout this period, Frank continued to perform, to record, and to maintain the public persona that had made him famous, but those closest to him could see the cracks forming. His voice, always his greatest asset, began to show strain. Recording sessions that once flowed effortlessly now required multiple takes. The easy confidence that had charmed audiences gave way to a more guarded, sometimes hostile public demeanor. The impact on Frank's artistry was profound. Songs that had once been delivered with effortless grace now carried undertones of anger and defiance. His interpretations of romantic ballads took on darker, more complex meanings. The experience of being hunted by his own government was transforming not just Frank the man but Frank the artist, creating new depths of emotion and understanding that would define his mature style. Columbia Records, Frank's label during this period, found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Frank's talent was undeniable, his commercial appeal proven, but the political risks of association with him were growing. Record executives held secret meetings to discuss the Sinatra problem, debating whether to support their star or distance themselves from potential scandal. The turning point came in 1950, when a congressional subcommittee, emboldened by the FBI's investigation, called Frank to testify about his alleged mob connections. The hearing, held in a packed Washington committee room, was televised live to a national audience hungry for scandal. Frank appeared in a dark suit, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, facing a panel of senators who had already decided his guilt. The scene in the hearing room was electric with tension. Senators sat behind a raised desk, their faces stern with assumed authority. Reporters packed the gallery, their cameras ready to capture any sign of guilt or defiance. In the witness chair sat Frank Sinatra, alone except for his attorney, facing the combined power of the federal government. "Mr. Sinatra," Committee Chairman Senator Pat McCarran began, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "Are you now or have you ever been associated with members of organized crime?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dozen cigarettes, and for a moment, Frank seemed to shrink before the assembled power of American justice. Frank's answer would be remembered for decades. "Senator, I have never been a member of any criminal organization. I have never committed any crime. I am an American citizen who happens to be of Italian descent, and I have been judged guilty of that crime by people who should know better." His voice carried a mixture of defiance and pain that resonated with millions of Americans watching at home. Americans who recognized the injustice of guilt by association. "But you haven't seen the biggest secret about his mob connections yet." The committee had prepared what they thought was their smoking gun, a series of photographs showing Frank in the company of known crime figures at various social events. But as the photographs were displayed on easels before the television cameras, a different story emerged. In every image, Frank appeared uncomfortable, out of place, more like a reluctant guest than an eager participant. The photographs told a story that the FBI hadn't expected. Rather than showing Frank as an active participant in criminal activities, they revealed him as someone who was often in the wrong place at the wrong time, someone whose celebrity status made him a magnet for people seeking legitimacy and respectability. In several images, Frank could be seen trying to leave events, his body language suggesting discomfort rather than criminal conspiracy. Defense attorney Edward Bennett Williams, representing Frank, stood to address the committee. "Gentlemen," he began, "you have shown us photographs of my client attending social functions in the company of men you consider criminals. But you have shown us no evidence of criminal activity, no proof of criminal conspiracy, no indication that Mr. Sinatra has ever violated any law of the United States or any state thereof." Williams was one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in America, and his methodical dismantling of the government's case was devastating. He had spent months preparing for this moment, reviewing every document, analyzing every photograph, and interviewing every witness the FBI had relied upon in building their case against Frank. The committee's case began to unravel under Williams' methodical cross-examination of FBI agents and bureau analysts. Time after time, agents were forced to admit that their surveillance had revealed no criminal activity, that their wiretaps had recorded no criminal conversations, that their investigation had produced suspicion but no proof. The ethnic profiling that had driven the investigation became impossible to ignore. Agent Fletcher, called to testify about his 3 years of surveillance, found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending an investigation that had cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars but produced no criminal charges. Under oath, he was forced to admit that Frank's criminal associations consisted primarily of attending the same social events as men who were themselves only suspected of criminal activity. "Agent Fletcher," Williams pressed, his voice carrying the authority of the courtroom, "in 3 years of intensive surveillance, did you ever observe my client commit a crime?" The answer was no. "Did you ever record my client planning a crime?" Again no. "Did you ever discover evidence that my client had benefited financially from any criminal enterprise?" A third time no. The foundation of the FBI's case crumbled with each question. The questioning revealed the extent to which the investigation had been based on assumptions rather than evidence. Fletcher was forced to admit that many of his reports had characterized innocent social interactions as potentially criminal based solely on the ethnic backgrounds of the people involved. The systematic nature of the Bureau's prejudice became undeniable under Williams' relentless examination. But the damage to Frank's career had already been done. Major venues began canceling his appearances, citing security concerns and public pressure. Radio stations pulled his records from rotation. Movie studios reconsidered his contracts. The entertainment industry, always sensitive to public opinion and government pressure, began to distance itself from the man they had once celebrated as America's voice. The blacklisting was subtle but effective. Frank would call his agent about potential bookings, only to be told that venues were unavailable or that insurance companies were reluctant to provide coverage. Record executives who had once competed for his services suddenly found reasons to delay contract negotiations. The machinery of his career ground to a halt without anyone officially declaring him persona non grata. The psychological warfare being waged against Frank extended beyond professional consequences. Death threats arrived daily at his homes in Hollywood and New York. FBI agents, whether deliberately or through negligence, had allowed details of Frank's movements and private life to leak to the press, making him a target for anyone with a grudge against organized crime or Italian Americans in general. The threats were credible and specific. Anonymous callers described the routes Frank took to recording sessions, the restaurants where he ate dinner, the hotels where he stayed while traveling. Some threats targeted not just Frank but his family, describing his children's schools and his wife's daily routines with chilling accuracy. Wait a minute, this detail was missed. But what happened in 1953? The FBI investigation officially concluded in 1953, with no criminal charges filed, but the unofficial surveillance would continue for decades. Frank had been cleared by Congress, exonerated by the courts, and vindicated by the failure of federal investigators to build a criminal case. But he had also learned hard lessons about the price of fame in America, about the thin line between celebrity and notoriety, about the way ethnic identity could be weaponized by those in power. The official conclusion of the investigation came with a quietly released statement acknowledging that no evidence of criminal activity has been discovered. But for Frank, vindication came too late. His career lay in ruins, his marriage was destroyed, and his faith in American justice had been permanently shattered. The boy from Hoboken, who had believed in the American dream, now understood its limitations. The experience changed Frank profoundly. The easy charm that had defined his early career gave way to a more complex persona, part showman, part tough guy, part wounded idealist. He became more guarded in his friendships, more careful in his business dealings, and more aware of the political implications of his artistic choices. The investigation that was meant to destroy him ultimately made him stronger, more complex and more interesting, as both an artist and a public figure. You won't believe what happened when Frank lost control of his anger that night. The breaking point came in late 1952, during a confrontation between Frank and FBI agents who had been following him for 5 years. The encounter took place outside a New York nightclub that Frank frequented, and it was witnessed by dozens of people who later described it as both frightening and pathetic. Agent Fletcher and his partner had been conducting routine surveillance when Frank suddenly approached their car. All witnesses described him as visibly agitated, his usually impeccable composure completely shattered. The stress of years of persecution had finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain the public facade that had protected him throughout the investigation. "What do you want from me?" he shouted at the agents through their car window. "I'm an American citizen. I served my country during the war. What more do you need?" The agents, trained to maintain professional detachment, simply stared at him through the windshield, saying nothing. Their silence only inflamed Frank's anger further. The confrontation escalated when Frank began pounding on the car's hood, his voice rising to a pitch that could be heard across the street. "5 years," he screamed. "5 years you've been following me. And for what? For what?" Passers-by stopped to watch the spectacle of America's most famous entertainer having what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown in full public view. The encounter lasted only minutes, but its impact reverberated for years. Photographs of the confrontation, taken by a newspaper photographer who happened to be nearby, showed Frank in a moment of complete vulnerability, a powerful man reduced to pleading with his own government for basic dignity and respect. The images became symbols of both the excesses of federal surveillance and the human cost of political persecution. "What you've seen so far is nothing." His career collapse was just beginning. The entertainment industry's blacklisting of Frank reached its peak in 1953, when he was unable to find work in any major venue in the United States. The man who had once commanded audiences of thousands was reduced to playing small clubs in obscure locations, often for a fraction of his former fees. The psychological impact of this professional exile was profound, affecting not only his income, but his sense of identity and self-worth. The transformation of Frank's career from triumph to disaster was swift and merciless. Venues that had once begged for his appearances now wouldn't return his manager's phone calls. Recording contracts that had once been automatically renewed were allowed to expire. Movie roles that had once been written specifically for him were suddenly unavailable or given to other actors. It was during this lowest point in his career that Frank made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than submit to the forces trying to destroy him, rather than apologize for associations he maintained were innocent, rather than beg for forgiveness from people he believed had wronged him, he chose to reinvent himself on his own terms. The experience of being hunted by his own government had taught him valuable lessons about power, loyalty, and survival that would serve him well in the years to come. The reinvention began with small steps, but each one was calculated to rebuild not just his career but his reputation on his own terms. He would never again be the innocent crooner from Hoboken, but he could become something more complex, more interesting, and ultimately more enduring, an American original who had survived the worst his government could do to him, and emerged stronger on the other side.